Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to this month's installment of the HRS Speaker Series. My name is Rod Walton. I am the Director of Outreach and the Learning Center here at Hamlin Robinson School. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules tonight to join us. I know there's a lot going on as we end the year and everyone's thinking about break and vacation, but you chose to be here, so we appreciate it. And we hope that there's a lot for you to take away for tonight's conversation, leaving you inspired and connected. The mission of Hamlin Robinson School is to ignite the academic and creative potential of students with dyslexia and other language-based learning differences. The HRS Learning Center is the community outreach arm of our school, a regional resource hub that offers such programs as tutoring, screenings, professional development, opportunities for educators and parents, and events like the speaker series. If you have questions during the presentation, please send them through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure that we share those with our guest speaker after the main presentation. If you're a Washington State educator and attend this full live event, you are eligible to register for clock hours. Visit our speaker series homepage on our website for more information. We'll be sharing a recording of tonight's event on the HRS Speaker Series homepage as well. A link will be posted sometime early next week. We want to make sure that we get that out before we leave for break, and we encourage you to share that link with anyone who might benefit from tonight's information. Also on that webpage, you can access recordings from my past events for over the last 3 years, all free of charge. Now on to our event. I am extremely honored to introduce tonight's keynote speaker for the evening, Dr. Karen Wilson. Karen is a clinical neuropsychologist, director of West LA Neuropsychology, and host of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. She specializes in assessing children and adolescents with learning differences and thinking differences, as well as social-emotional challenges. Dr. Wilson is also the founder of CEO of Child Nexus, a digital platform that provides parent support services for neurodivergent, learning disabilities, and youth mental health. Dr. Wilson is a sought-after expert speaker who has shared her expertise through television, radio, podcast, print, and online media outlets. Dr. Wilson also was recognized as California State University Dominguez Hills by California State University Dominguez Hills as an expert scholar and educator who is among the most distinguished experts in her field. She continues to pave the way for a future where every learner with learning differences, thrives through innovation and through innovative and inclusive practices. Karen is actually joining us live tonight from Toronto, where it is really, really cold, and we hope she's staying warm. And we thank you, Karen, for joining us tonight, even though it's very late out there, joining our community. And we'll welcome you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rod. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak and share some information with your community. I'm grateful for the Hamlin Robinson School, again, for the invitation and for allowing me to be here with you all today. I do want to acknowledge that I know that this school has experienced a profound loss and the community has experienced a profound loss. And anytime you lose a student, it's heartbreaking, it's devastating. And my thoughts are with the educators, families who are really carrying the weight of this tragedy. So I didn't want to not acknowledge it because it is a heavy thing that a lot of you all are experiencing right now. My hope is that tonight I'll be able to share some information about how to support students with learning challenges, with mental health challenges, and to talk about how they are connected. And with that, I will get started on that presentation. All right. All right. So again, I'm really excited to be able to talk about a topic that I feel very passionate about. I've spent the last 20 years working with students with learning and thinking differences, and have seen over those 20 years and from the research that learning challenges and mental health challenges are linked. And we don't often talk enough about the link between them. And I think that tonight is a good time to talk about that link and what we can do to support students. I want us to understand the link between learning and mental health challenges, but then also to understand other factors that also impact student emotional well-being in general, things like sleep, exercise, technology, and talk about some of the ways that we can act as buffers to a lot of the stressors that our kids are experiencing and how to support them. When I think about students who, and we work in communities with students who have thinking and learning differences, it's 1 in 5 students who has a learning or a thinking challenge that impacts their daily functioning, school, outside of school, and 20 to 25% of young people will have a mental health issue by the time they reach age 18. And we know that students with learning challenges are even greater risk for having these mental health challenges. And what we thought was, during COVID, it seems like it was a long time ago, 2020, 2021, we were in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. And what we're seeing now is that that crisis really hasn't dissipated. Students are still experiencing high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety, high levels of depression, and those rates have really skyrocketed over the last decade. We got a lot of attention just around COVID time and post COVID, but those numbers were increasing since 2011, right? If they've been increasing for a long period of time, I think what COVID did is it just lifted the veil at what was already there, and those numbers continue to climb. And so I think it's important to pay attention to those numbers, because when you're talking about 70% increase, 95% increase in anxiety, those are striking numbers, which means that there are a lot of students who are struggling. And we have to be able to identify when they're struggling and provide that emotional support, but then also recognize the warning signs so that we can intervene earlier for those students. So again, I work with students with learning and thinking differences. I know the Hamlin Robinson School serves students with language-based learning challenges. And we know those are the kiddos, those are the young people who are at greater risk for experiencing mental health challenges. And we think about the primary mental health challenges. We think about depression, we think about low self-concept, and think about anxiety. The warning signs, we often think that they're going to be obvious, right? So if a child is struggling with depression, we're going to see the tears, we're going to see the sadness, we're going to hear them say the words that they're lonely and no one likes them and they don't have friends and they're feeling really sad and hopeless. But oftentimes it doesn't look like that. Oftentimes the signs are not always as that clear, right? What it looks like sometimes are kids who are really high strung, and parents will see they seem like they're very tightly wound, and they can be really irritable, right? At the drop of a hat, something can cause an emotional outburst, something that's very small. You see it show up in disturbances in sleep. Either they have a hard time falling asleep, they have a hard time staying asleep, they're getting up when they're asleep, or they're sleeping too much and they're having a hard time getting up in the morning, even though they've been asleep for a long period of time. You also see what we call a lot of somatic symptoms that can be indications of anxiety, particularly things like stomach aches and headaches that a lot of parents will say, I took them to the doctor and they ran some tests and they couldn't find anything that was wrong. And oftentimes those can be indications, particularly when physical issues have been ruled out, to look a little deeper to see whether it could be anxiety, particularly if you look at the timing of it. Some parents will say, like, we're about to have a winter break, that everything is fine. But then when it's time to almost go back to school, then you see the headaches and the stomach aches, and I'm not feeling very well. And that can indicate that maybe there's some anxiety related to school or to something else. What we often see too are an avoidance or a lack of interest in things that kids used to do. And so that sometimes that is a reflection of a change in the way that they were before, where they used to want to have kids over for play dates and want to go to birthday parties and eager to get out of the door in the morning to go to school. And all of a sudden they want to avoid those things. They don't want to do those things anymore. They don't have that interest, or they're complaining of being bored when they used to be able to do things that occupied their time. And so oftentimes those are ways that mental health challenges like anxiety and depression can show up for kids. For some kids, the signs may have been there early on. It can look like extreme shyness. Extreme shyness can be a way that a language-based disorder manifests in kids who don't have the language to tell you what they're experiencing, or it can be extreme anxiety that can be manifesting as shyness. Perfectionism is another way, where kids are afraid of making mistakes. They're afraid of people finding out that they're not perfect, that they're not doing the right thing. And so they are combating that anxiety by trying to do everything perfect. They will write on a paper and then erase everything that they've written and then write it again and then they'll erase everything they've written. And that perfectionism can be an indication of anxiety. Students who struggle with depression often have self-concept issues, right? They don't feel good about themselves and who they are and their place in the world. There can be feelings of hopelessness, like nothing is going to change. Things are bad now. They're always going to be bad. They're not going to get better. And so that can play a role. For some kids, it can be restlessness, which can be how anxiety manifests, a lot of pacing and walking back and forth and having difficulty sitting still a lot of times. Though there are a lot of anxious thoughts that are racing through their heads, and that can create and contribute to some of that restlessness. And then if we think about somatic symptoms, I talked about the headaches and the stomach aches, and it can also look like changes in appetite where kids who may have enjoyed certain foods all of a sudden don't want to eat, get full very easily, they're not hungry anymore, or they're eating too much. So again, the signs of when kids are struggling with anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges are not always clear. And oftentimes we might need some support and have a professional take a look to ensure that we're not missing something that really needs attention. I hope that makes sense to everyone. So the other thing I often have parents ask about is how do we know when we should be concerned, right? Because kids will experience anxiety. They'll be nervous before a test. They'll be nervous when they're starting a new school or starting a new grade. If they're trying out for a team, all of that is normal to feel nervous and to feel anxious about those situations. Kids feel sad sometimes. You know, they're rejected by their peers, or they don't have a good day, or they don't do well on a test. And all of those feelings are normal for them to experience. And anxiety is actually something that's very adaptive. It keeps us alive, right? When we are, you know, or somebody jumps out at us and we're not expecting it, our body's response is to make sure that we are safe. Is this something that I should be fearful of? Should I run? Should I freeze? Should I ask for help? And so that's our body's response to protecting ourselves, to make sure that we are not in danger. But when that fear response, that anxious response happens and occurs frequently, and there's really no threat, that's when it kind of can cross the threshold of an anxiety disorder. And when that happens, it also is happening in a way that it's interfering with a teenager's daily functioning. It's keeping them from doing things that they want to do. They are worried about something and it's impacting their ability to learn in the classroom. It's impacting their ability to connect with peers. It's impacting their ability to do other things in their community, even with their family. And so where it crosses the threshold of kind of normal nervousness and normal sadness that can kind of come and go, it's when it's excessive, when it's happening very often, when it's happening frequently, and when it is causing some level of distress or interference in their functioning. So it's interfering with, again, like I said, at school, with their ability to learn in the classroom. It's really difficult for kids to sit in a classroom and learn and pay attention and be engaged when they're worried, right? When they're worried, when they're nervous, when they're fearful. And so that would be a case where the anxiety is interfering with their ability to learn. If the anxiety is so strong that it impacts their ability to reach out to friends, to maintain friendships, to connect with others, because their fear of being rejected is so strong, then that is a time when we want to be paying more attention. And what we do know is that when we see some of those warning signs and we're not sure, and some of those physical symptoms have been ruled out, and we think that there might be something else going on, it's really important to check with mental health professionals, to check with a pediatrician, a family doctor, because oftentimes they have screenings, you know, simple mental health screenings that they can take up to 5 minutes, right? 5 to 15 minutes to do. And it can reveal a lot of information and let you know whether or not this is normal or whether this is something that you should be paying attention to and need to seek out support for your child. One thing to keep in mind is that kids will experience stressors, they'll experience anxiety, they'll have periods of sadness. And what the research tells us is that even in the best of times when things are going really well, that school is one of the most common sources of stress for children and teens. And as we approach middle school to high school, nearly 60% of teenagers in high school, 40% of middle schoolers report that time management, those executive functions, are the activities that create the most amount of stress. It's hard to keep up. You're afraid of you're not turning things in on time. You feel overwhelmed by all of the things that you need to do. You can't plan, you can't organize, you can't manage your time. You feel like you're falling behind. You can't keep up relative to your peers. And that creates a great deal of stress for students. But again, if we recognize the stress and we provide students with the appropriate support, those anxiety levels come down considerably. Self-confidence increases. So it's really about making sure that students are getting the support that they need. If it's an academic struggle, if they need support for executive functioning and time management, for reading, for writing, when they're getting the support that they need, a lot of that stress can come down considerably. Again, a lot of the anxiety will dissipate, and then the confidence will improve as a result. Academic pressure is at an all-time high. You know, it's one of those things that we kind of have identified as modern stressors. You know, when I was in school, yes, there was academic pressure, but it's not like it is now. I don't know, Rod, if you think it's changed a great deal, I see you nodding. It has changed a great deal in terms of the pressure the students are experiencing in school, where the academic demands have increased considerably, starting in kindergarten, where kindergarten used to be totally play-based, and now kids are expected to be reading in a lot of schools by kindergarten. And again, the academic demands and what we're expecting of students has increased considerably. And when a student is struggling academically, struggling with a learning or a thinking difference that directly impacts their ability to perform academically, that is an added stressor for those students. So those students who are neurodivergent, who have language-based learning challenges that impact reading and writing, all of the things that are measured in academic settings, that is an additional stressor. And for students of color, there's another stressor. One of them is stereotype threat, which is the idea that there are these stereotypes about you based on your cultural background, based on your race, based on your socioeconomic status that people have about others who have those backgrounds. And there's this fear of confirming those stereotypes when you are not doing well. And that is an added stressor for students of color because they may not be doing well because of their language-based learning difference, but for them, they do not want to be perceived as not doing well because of the ethnic group that they belong to. And that is an added layer of stress and anxiety for students of color who also are neurodivergent or struggling with learning and thinking differences. So it's something to keep in mind, something for educators to be mindful of, and something to pay attention to so that we can provide, again, the appropriate level of support in a way that is culturally responsive, right? When I talk about the modern stressors, I've talked about the academic pressure, which is something that is fairly new over the last 10 years. I think it's been increasing steadily over, probably the last couple of decades. But young people, and Rod and I were talking about this before the call even started, it's the technology that students are exposed to. And that pressure, that modern stressor that's connected technology, one of them is the constant online comparisons, whether that's to academics, hey, I got another A on this test, whether it's like, those teenagers who are posting all of the acceptances that they got to the universities that they got admitted to, and social online comparisons, right? That online comparison that is constant, particularly for students who are online or on social media, creates an added level of stress because students feel like they are constantly being compared to their peers, and many feel like they are not living up to where their peers are, right? Students have always been concerned about being accepted by others, having a peer group, having a friend group, and that is probably exacerbated by technology and the idea of having friends and followers. And so that is creating an additional stressor as well. We'll talk about how technology is impacting. I've talked about the academic rigor and the academic competition that is increased. And students are concerned more now than ever, probably because of technology and access to 24-hour news and notifications about school shootings and tragedies and things happening and the future and politics. They're being exposed to things at a younger age than we have. A lot of adults who might be on this call have experienced before. And so all of these things contribute to the stressors that our young people are experiencing. And we don't want to minimize them, right? They're walking by the television as you're watching CNN or Fox News, whatever you have on the television, they're seeing those things. It's getting encoded into their brains. Even when you switch the channel, they've already seen it, they've already heard the soundbite, and they may have been reinforced by other things that people say. If they have access to a phone, there might be notifications that are popping up. And so all of those things are contributing to the thoughts that they have, the fears that they have, the things that they're thinking about, the things that they're concerned about. And we have to be mindful that these additional modern stressors are contributing to some of the mental health challenges that our students face. It's increasing rates. And if anyone has seen the movie, and if you recognize these two characters from Inside Out, anxiety and depression, right? These are the most common mental health challenges that students face, and adolescents are most vulnerable to experiencing these conditions. And one of the reasons why is because adolescence is such a vulnerable time, right? The brain is changing very quickly. And for students who have learning and thinking differences, there's this mismatch between societal expectations and where they are. And particularly when we think about, again, the school and executive functioning demands, oftentimes many of our students who have learning and thinking differences struggle with executive functioning. That's planning and organization and time management. It's also emotional regulation and the ability to think about things and inhibit distractions in your environment, all of those things that impact students. And there's a mismatch between what is expected and where they are developmentally and where they are in terms of their brain. We know that those executive functionings that I mentioned are the last to develop in individuals. And so as students and children evolve, all of those things will get better over time, right? Even students who struggle early on with all of those executive functions, they will get better. If you didn't do any intervention, everyone will get better at a time, over time. But some students will struggle more. And so relative to their peers, they will struggle more. Everyone will increase, but they'll still be behind relative to their peers. We know that, again, that front part of the brain that is responsible for those executive functions is not fully developed until students are in their mid-20s, right? So there's a lot of time for the frontal lobe to develop. For students with ADHD, for example, there can be as much as a 3-year delay in the development of that part of the brain, which means that they're going to struggle more with a lot of those executive functions over time. The reason why the executive functions are so important is because teenagers, particularly, and even middle schoolers, love those social rewards. They like to be told, oh, you look really nice today, right? Oh, that was a great answer that you just gave to the class. I like the way you said that. I like, the way that you present yourself. I like the way you play soccer or basketball. They love that praise. And for many students, that praise is now coming in terms of technology, in terms of likes and followers, right? And so that's an immediate social reward. And their brains are designed to want that social reward. At the same time, here's the mismatch. They want the social reward, but then their front part of the brain is a part of the brain that allows them to restrain themselves, to hold themselves back, to not do the thing that they're not supposed to do, to not be impulsive. And that part of the brain is not going to be fully developed until their mid-20s. And so they will act impulsively. They will do things that they're not supposed to do. They will say things that they're not supposed to say, and they will want the things that they shouldn't have and have access to, and they will not be able to hold themselves back. So they will search for things that they shouldn't be searching for. They will go down rabbit holes. They will post things that they shouldn't post. They will comment and say things that they shouldn't say, not because they don't mean well, but because they do not have the brain ability to restrain themselves the way that adults would. And so that is something to keep in mind, particularly when they have access to technology, right? And so that can also, again, when they post something that they shouldn't have said, and then they get backlash for that, there's the stressor, there's the anxiety, there's the confidence issue, because then their peers may not like that what they said or what they posted, and they've already done it because they weren't able to restrain themselves. And so we have to keep in mind that while their brain is developing, they need support and guidance, because that judgment center of the brain, which is also in the front part of the brain, again, not fully developed until their mid-20s. And so they're not going to use good judgment. The decision-making part of their brain, not fully developed until their mid-20s. So they're going to make bad decisions. They're going to exercise poor judgment. They're not going to be able to inhibit their impulses. And yet they're going to want certain things. And so we have to be able to provide support and provide guidance while their brains are developing and while they're responding to this modern world. Does that make sense to everyone? You can put in I think we're allowed emojis and things in the chat. So feel free to give a thumbs up if you understand or if that is resonating with you. Oh, I see I love the thumbs up. Okay, here we go. So when we think about that poor impulse control, and we think about students who are now in this digital world where kids have access to many media platforms, from TikTok to Instagram to Snapchat, Discord, all of those platforms, YouTube, particularly for younger kids, we know from the research that is changing their brain. Do we know how? We have some indication of how it is changing. We do not know what the long-term ramifications will be. So when we think about what we do know is that technology in and of itself is not bad. It's the excessive use of technology that creates problems. So kids who are spending 30 minutes a day, an hour a day, it's not harmful, right? Depending on what they're doing, right? It also depends on what they're doing, and then how long they're doing it for. And so when we think about how much time students are spending on screens, most people would guess about 2 hours, 3 hours. I don't know. Rod, what would you guess in terms of how much time students are spending on screens approximately a day? Not work related, not school related.
I would probably say 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah. Okay.
At least.
It's 5 to 8.
Wow.
That is on recreational screen time. So that is not school-based. And for teens, much of that time is spent on social media. When I think of 8 hours, that is a full-time job for most. That's a work day. That's how much time many students are spending on screens. 5 to 8 hours a day is the average. 48% of adolescents say that they are constantly online, right? They're constantly online. That's almost half. And 40% of 2-year-olds, even though we say that technology, kids 2 and under should not have access to screens, 40% of 2-year-olds have their own tablet. 40% have their own tablet by age 2, right? And so we're living, and this is why I say that we are living in a digital world, and students are being exposed to screens at a younger age, and they're spending more time on it, particularly the older that they get. The teenagers are spending the most time. Why this is important when we think about social media in particular and technology in general, higher levels of screen time has been associated with delays in development, which is why we don't want screens before age 2, because it can impact language development, which we know is critical. Language development is directly related to later reading and writing skills, right? And the ability to do math word problems. So it's impacting all of the core areas of academics down the road. What we know is that when students are introduced to screens very early on, before age 2, and they spend a great deal of time, their reading and writing and word problem scores are lower when they get to those early elementary school years. So there's delays in language development. We also know that the more time students spend on screens, the more inattentive they are. You see more behavioral problems. A lot of parents will say that they see more emotional meltdowns, particularly when they're transitioning off of screens into activities that are non-screen related. And there's higher rates of loneliness and depression, even though they're connecting. A lot of students say they're connecting on social media and they're connecting with their peers. Again, all screens are not bad. Students play games together, and there are ways to connect and to stay connected and to text each other and to have those conversations. But again, it's the excessive use, what they're finding. And there's been studies done out of UC San Diego finding that loneliness increases the more the students spend on social media, and so does depression, right? We also know that there's an increase in suicide related behavior the more students spend time on screens and are exposed to screens. So what we know is that early exposure to technology can delay development. Again, it can impact all of those things are directly related to academics and social and emotional well-being. The more students spend on screens, we also know, particularly when students are on screens late at night, it can directly impact sleep, right? Students will say that they went on to just check their messages before they went to bed, and then they end up scrolling for longer than they intended, which impacts their ability to go to sleep at a decent time so that they can get sufficient sleep. Some students will sleep with the phone beside them, which they should never do. Unless it's in airplane mode or turned off completely and they're just charging it. Even then, that could be done in another room. But the notifications can disrupt sleep if students are responding to those notifications. So we know that screen technology can impact sleep, and sleep is critical for mental health and well-being. And that is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to talk about sleep, because a lot of the things that I've been talking about today are interrelated. They're related, and sleep is one of the things that you can check tonight to see what times your kids go to bed, what time they wake up in the morning, and see if they're getting sufficient sleep. And I would say track it over the course of a week to make sure, because oftentimes you don't know. But as human beings, we spend 1/3 of our lives in a state of sleep. So it's pretty important that we are getting sufficient sleep. And 70% of kids and adults are getting insufficient sleep. They're not getting an adequate amount of sleep at night. And sleep is foundational for cognitive development. It's when we sleep, that is when all of the things that kids learn during the day get transferred from short-term memory into long-term memory. It's when we consolidate all of the learning that happens during the day. When we don't get enough sleep, it disrupts that pattern. We also know that the sleep disruption or inadequate sleep can contribute to emotional dysregulation. You think about a toddler that has not had a nap. It is virtually the same thing for children and adolescents who don't get sufficient sleep. It may not be a meltdown in a grocery store, but it will look more like irritability for kids who aren't getting enough sleep. And then you get daytime sleepiness, which will impact learning and classroom engagement, and decreased alertness, which impacts attention in the classroom. If you do not know how much sleep your child should be getting, here's an idea. So, and there's a range because kids are different, 10 to 13 hours for kids in preschool to kindergarten. Kids between the ages of 6 and 12 should be getting 9 to 12 hours of sleep, right? The younger they are, the more sleep you should be getting. School-age kids typically should be getting on average 10 hours of sleep a night. On average, school-age children, elementary school, middle school, should be getting 10 hours of sleep. Even teenagers, 16-year-olds, should be getting at least 9.5 hours of sleep. It doesn't even drop down to 8 until you are in adulthood in terms of how much sleep, because their brains are still developing. Again, you're thinking about this frontal lobe that is not fully developed until mid-20s. The brain needs to develop, and sleeping is a time when a lot of those, again, connections are being made, and it's critical for cognitive development and for social and emotional well-being. Everybody want to give me a thumbs up if you know this, if you agree, if you are going to check the Fitbit on your kid tonight to see if they're getting sufficient sleep. Many parents are surprised at how much sleep their kids are getting. They think it's sufficient, and it's often inadequate, particularly over an extended period of time. So, one thing you can do tonight after you leave is to track your kids' sleep and track it over the course of a week and see if they're getting sufficient sleep at night. Once in a while is not going to be a big deal, but if you notice, oh, it's 7 hours, it's 7 hours, it's 7.5, it's 8, and they are school age, that is chronic sleep deprivation over an extended period of time. Insufficient sleep can contribute to a lot of the things we see with over excessive technology use. We see problems with attention, problems with focus. We see emotional dysregulation, those difficulties with executive functioning. And in fact, oftentimes kids show up to assessments where parents think that they might have ADHD. Teachers think that it might be ADHD, but when you do a good history and you get that information, you realize that it's chronic sleep deprivation, which can mimic ADHD symptoms. And oftentimes, when kids get sufficient sleep, then you realize that all of those difficulties go away, right? And it wasn't ADHD, it was actually sleep deprivation, insufficient sleep that the child was experiencing. Again, over time, insufficient sleep can create that emotional dysregulation and can contribute to some of those mental health challenges that I was talking about before, puts kids at greater risk for anxiety and depression. So knowing that, we already kind of know what we can do to enhance youth well-being. Two things right away. We can make sure that kids are not spending 8 hours a day, right, on technology, on YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok. We can reduce that so they're not spending excessive amounts of time on screens. Typically, when we cross over that 5 hour threshold a day, that's when it becomes problematic, when we're seeing it impact significant functioning. We also know if sleep is critical, making sure that students are getting adequate sleep is another way that we can enhance well-being. From doing those two things alone, we can enhance youth well-being. One of the things that we know, if we're thinking about what are things that we can do as parents and educators, who have children in our lives, what the research tells us in terms of building resilience, having relationships, strong relationships. When students have strong relationships with adults that they can trust, that they can go to, who they feel, are looking out for their well-being, that they can speak to and they feel safe with, that is one of the biggest factors, if not the biggest factor, in enhancing resilience and overall well-being, right? And so that connection is critical. And that kind of goes hand in hand with technology, right? If students are in their rooms and they're just scrolling, they're not connecting with people in real life, right? They're not, sitting on, a couch having a conversation, sitting across a dinner table. They're not going for a walk. They're not doing those things that can enhance relationships and connection. And connection is really key to enhancing well-being. We also know from the research that mattering matters, right? And what do I mean by mattering? Mattering is the feeling that you are valued, right? The feeling that you are valued, and in whatever environment you are in, whether that's your family, your school, or community, that you add value just by being there, just by being who you are. And when we can let kids know that they matter, that they're valued, and that they add value to the environments that they are in, that is a strong predictor of positive well-being. That is a strong predictor of lowered anxiety and lowered depression and increased resilience in young people, even if they're struggling with learning challenges. They can struggle with learning challenges, but if they feel that they are valued and they matter, that can be a strong buffer against the emotional issues that a lot of students can experience. It also builds confidence and hopefulness because they have greater hope for their future and their place in the world when they feel that educators or their parents feel that they matter, and their peers as well. So when we think about ways to support the kids, the children, and the teens in our lives, we want to be able to promote, sleep. We want to make sure they're getting enough exercise. We want to build those relationships and those connections, and we want to make sure that they know that they matter. We want to, part of the way we affirm that they matter is affirming their identities, affirming their and acknowledging their strengths. Oftentimes, when kids are struggling, we over focus on providing support, and that's important. We want kids with dyslexia to be able to have access to interventions that are evidence based that improve reading. We want to make sure kids with dysgraphia have support for writing, kids with dyscalculia have support for math. But we also want to make sure that those kids who are struggling, that we also see their strengths, right? Their strengths in their creativity and their artistic ability and their ability to connect with their peers and their ability to give a verbal argument, to be able to share stories and to tell a story and to be dramatic in a play or to play an instrument or to play a sport. We have to recognize those strengths as well. And those are ways that we can affirm and acknowledge and show kids that they belong in all of these spaces that they're in. Other things that we can do to promote and support well-being is, we know that when kids are anxious, when they have attention issues and they can be emotionally dysregulated, that mindfulness can be a really great practice that can make a big difference and can go a long way. I often say it doesn't have to be 20 minutes sitting cross-legged on a floor. It can be 3 minutes before they start their homework. It can be 2 minutes before they go to bed. It can be 2 minutes before they get out of the car to go to school in the morning. That can go a long way in terms of reducing anxiety, reducing stress levels, and improving focus. And so there are little things that we can do to support and introduce that strategy to students. We all also know that expressing gratitude to kids and them expressing gratitude to other people can also increase those endorphins that make us feel good, make us feel connected to the people that we're showing gratitude for, and that can also enhance well-being. We also know that when kids are struggling, they often can form their own narratives about why they're struggling, that they're not smart, that they're not working hard enough, that everyone else can do things easier than they can. One thing that we can do is to promote that growth mindset, that this is a struggle now, but it can get better, right? I can't do this now, or I can't do this yet. So improving in introducing the power of yet, which a lot of people talk about, that gives them the hope that things can get better, that they can get better at this thing that is hard for them. So these are different ways that we can support kids. We can do it in a number of different ways. It doesn't have to be one thing to support their emotional well-being. I think it's also important when we're talking about kids who are struggling with mental health, whether that's anxiety or depression, loneliness, or a very low self-concept, is that we reach out when we know that there's a struggle or we suspect there's a struggle, to reach out for help, to seek the support of a mental health professional, to get a referral from your family physician or your pediatrician, to go to your community center, to get a referral from a teacher or a school, to get the support that they need to address the mental health issues. And if kids are struggling, that they also get the support through a learning center or through educators or through an educational therapist to provide that support for reading, for writing, for executive functioning, so that they can feel more empowered, more confident, and particularly as they see that those skills are improving and they're doing better. It's really important to get the supports that students need when they need it, and also to lean into your community to get those additional resources. Because again, it's that connection and those relationships that really make a big difference. And so when we think about kind of in general, what we can do to support our children and teens, this is kind of like a cheat sheet, right? That's in front of you. It's kind of all the things that we've talked about that we can do to support young people. And we want to make sure that they're getting the support that they need for their learning, of course. But we also need to prioritize certain things. We want to prioritize relationships and connection over everything else. Because when you feel like there are people that you can trust, people who have your best interests at heart and you feel safe with, it's easier to learn, right? It's easier to learn. You're more motivated to work hard on those things that are more difficult for you. And so we know that, again, that will be something that's really important for enhancing well-being and to decreasing some of the mental health struggles that students will face. We know that sleep is important, exercise is important, and having a well balanced diet. Those are things that we can prioritize and should prioritize. We should limit screen time. I'm not going to say eliminate it because nowadays we're doing everything on screens. Homework is on Chromebooks, they're on iPads, they're accessing technology for a number of different things. They're connecting with their peers, right? That is important. Students play video games together and they're connecting and they're texting each other, and all of those things are really important. But we want to make sure that we are balancing screen time, screen activities with non-screen activities, right? We don't want to have it the screen activities weigh so much that they're not playing soccer, they're not in Girl Scouts, they're not in an art club, they're not doing theater or dance or doing these other activities. We want to make sure that there's balance there, and having that balance is very important. Again, we want to empower students, we want to acknowledge their concerns, we want to validate the things that they're experiencing and feeling, the stressors, the concerns that they have. We talked about the modern stressors. We want to acknowledge and validate those. And again, we want to be sure that we're providing the support when we see that they need that support. And we want to minimize the stressors that are in their lives. We want to, again, when we talk about technology, we want to limit those exposures to stressful things and stressful events that are on the television. We want to minimize the stress by engaging in those activities that we know will lower those stress levels. Things like mindfulness, exercise will do that. Spending time outdoors in nature, spending time face to face next to someone that you can put your hand on and lean into, all of those things can minimize stress, releases dopamine and oxytocin, all of those things that make us feel good and feel connected to other people. And so all of these are all things that we can do to support our children and teens. When I think about kids, I think about children and teens as like plants, right? And what do plants need? You need to prioritize the soil, right? We want to make sure that they have enough nutrients in that soil, that there's enough water. We want to make sure plants are getting enough sunlight. So when we think about the things that students need in terms of those priorities that they need and plants need, the soil, that is the relationships, that is the connection that they need. They need sleep, they need to be physically active. Those are the things that we prioritize when we say we're prioritizing the soil. And we want to limit the weeds, and we want to limit all of those harsh conditions. Those are the stressors. Those are the things that chip away and can impact the growth of our children, of our plants. So when we tend to our children and we make sure that their soil is being nourished, what we're doing is we're giving them the opportunity to flourish, and not just for today, but for years to come. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for this discussion. There's so much in my head right now, just thinking about the things that you talked about, especially about value. I feel like when we talk about all the stressors and the intersection of, social media, societal pressures, the way we see ourselves, our own self-reflection, and how we interact with others, that theme of value just keeps coming up, right? Because all of it's seems to culminate and be tied to value, um, in that we want to see ourselves in a certain way, right, and project ourselves into the world in a certain way. And a lot of these stressors and interactions that we have with social media with other people can derail that and put us on a different path mentally or spiritually, academically, and especially when you have a learning difference, there's already a challenge that's there that you're navigating, and then these layered stresses on top of that just can really be a horrible experience at times. But thinking about myself as an educator or as a parent, as someone who's supporting a student, think of being mindful of the ways that I can help create a more inclusive environment. And it's interesting that you mentioned mindfulness, because I had a discussion earlier today with one of our teachers about how she introduces mindfulness, especially when students are transitioning into her classroom or before they're about to do a major project or something activity together, and how important and transitional it's really been for those groups to be able to expect moments of regulation, to be able to come into that space, to be mindful around what's happening, coming to that space, resetting, getting focused, and then being able to work together because now you're thinking about all the ways you can contribute or you're leaving kind of the stressors behind and you're collectively in that space together, leaning on each other. And I think that's really going to be important. And as adults, as we're creating this space, as we're limiting the screen time, as we're creating mindful moments with students, and helping them through productive struggle, helping them build their identity and grit. It's also that level of grace, right? And that you mentioned that they're not being able to fully develop until their early 20s, right? And so
Right.
they're making big decisions as middle schoolers and tweens and teens that they don't understand that they're making, right? And how can we not present ourselves as triggers, be positive, affirming buffers, and help them navigate those spaces in a really affirming way and
Right.
understand where they're coming from and their reasoning, right? As they're making these decisions or actions, but being able to talk with them and navigate them through it and be able to provide resources, even if it's not directly from you, but just making it available, right? And trying to position ourselves as a trusted adult. And sometimes they may not directly talk to us, all right? It may be through someone else as a conduit, or they just want to take information, process it on their own before they have that conversation. But how can we make all of those resources and paths of opportunity and resource available, even if they're not directly coming to us for help?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And when you talk about mindfulness, it then becomes a tool that you'll see kids use on their own when they're
Yeah,
feeling nervous. They'll start taking those deep breaths because they
yeah,
know it helps. And so then that becomes a tool in their toolkit that they can
yeah,
utilize when they need it. Right. And so
exactly.
they can engage in that self-talk, you
Yeah,
know, and say those things to themselves that boost confidence. Right. And so we want to be able to teach them those skills and to help them build their toolkit so that they can have this and use the strategies that they need.
yeah.
Need it.
Exactly. That self-advocacy piece is so important. We want to keep the conversation going, so please use your question and answer toolbar to add any questions that you might have for Dr. Wilson right now. Someone did ask for a parent-friendly resource that they can share with their own teachers around efficient sleep, insufficient sleep, excuse me, that you might possibly be able to recommend. And we can also share at a later date if you wanted to send it
Yeah,
to me and I can share
I
it.
can send it to you because I did a podcast episode on sleep, and I had also had a sleep expert talk about how it impacts students. I'd be happy to send you the links to those
Yeah.
episodes. Yeah.
Great. Um, what other ways would you suggest? I'm thinking particularly in the classroom when we're thinking about students with learning differences, and I'm thinking about our school in general, or spaces where we are designed specifically for students with learning differences, are coming from traumatic experiences, maybe in their previous school, maybe their own self-reflection and projections of not being adequate enough or not being smart enough, and then coming to a space where there's affirming and full support. How can we help those families and the students both? Because oftentimes the focus is just on the student, but how can we help families and students transition to that space and build trust before we can really get to the work?
Right. I think it's really important. I think it's one is to be able to understand the experience that they had before, right?
Yeah,
And understand why they're seeking out a different kind of learning experience and what their expectations are, right? What are they expecting? And then and then you talk about what it is that you are going to provide, right? And then what that does is it kind of gives a contrast in terms of what the expectations will be, but then also you want to let them know that, this is going to take time. So oftentimes you don't want the expectation to be that on the first day everything is going to be different and it's going to be completely, you're never going to have any of the struggles that you had before, they're
yeah,
all going to go away. You want it to be kind of rooted in reality, but then
yeah,
I think the most important thing is that we're going to be supportive the whole time. We're going to listen to you. We're going to, if you have feedback for us, we want to hear it. If we need to adjust things, we're willing to adjust things. But we want to know, we want you to be collaborators with us so that we can make sure that we're giving you what you need. And so I think that goes a long way because it validates their previous experiences. It also has, for educators, you have a better understanding of what their expectations are, but then you're also collaborating with them and seeking their feedback throughout the process.
How do you, what do you think about how we should approach in the classroom, how we leverage technology? We talked about the challenges that come with, with screen time, inappropriate screen time, too much of it. But oftentimes, as you mentioned before, we're living on screens, and a lot of times in many school districts and many schools,
Mhm.
you're on screens most of the day working.
Right.
How do you build a healthy balance of having to learn and work on screens throughout the day and then be able to, you know, wean yourself off, and how do we kind of guide that because we're in such a technology heavy society and experience during throughout the school day to kind of taper that experience off when we're going home and transitioning out of the classroom.
I think it goes back to striking a balance, right? And also modeling that balance, right? It's one thing to say to your kids, you're spending too much time on screens when dad is sitting there scrolling on Facebook or Instagram, or at the dinner table where it's sitting like another person on the dinner table. You have to model that behavior and and to you model it and then it becomes the expectation where we're not only doing this, we're also going to do things. We're going to play a board game as a family. We're going to
Yeah.
go for a walk. We're going to go and check out, the Santa Claus parade or whatever it might be.
Okay.
We're going to go to the museum on the weekend. We're going to go do other things. You're modeling that balance, and I think it's important in educational and home settings to be able to do that, right? If you have friends at school, well, let's have them over. Let's have a pizza party. Let's have them over to the house. So doing those kinds of things, hosting, kids over for a game night or Jenga, whatever it might be. Again,
Yeah.
modeling that balance and having those opportunities to connect and laugh and to feel
Yeah.
that real person beside you.
Exactly. Someone asked, can you talk more about how to help children navigate the stressors of school? What would you recommend that a parent do in a situation of school refusal?
Yeah, I think with school refusal, that can be significant. I mean, I think one thing I would say is to seek out a mental health professional because that can be really a significant issue if a student you really need to have a plan, like a real thought out plan. And school refusal is different for different kids because they have different triggers and different reasons why they're not wanting to go to school. And so a mental health professional can help identify the reason for the refusal and then target that reason in the intervention and the support. And that will come with collaboration with the parent and the school to address what that issue is. Because again, it's very individualized in terms of the reason for school refusal. So I would seek the guidance and the support of a mental health professional. But I've only seen it work successfully when you have a mental health professional on board and there's collaboration between the school and the parent.
Hmm. I think my next question is, how can we, as educators, counselors, folks that are supporting students with learning differences, um, help educate families around that front lobal
Mm.
brain development? I think that backstory and context is often something we don't talk about, and the
Right.
missing piece of the behavior, the dysregulation, and how that all connects. We don't talk about that piece of it enough.
I think two things. One is you introduce it in the classroom. I
Yeah,
think kids should understand their brains. They should understand that brains operate differently, they're wired differently, they're still developing. That's actually helps with the growth mindset because you're going to get better at this thing because your brain is still developing.
yeah,
And then you talk about it at your parent teacher conferences, right? There's a perfect opportunity when you have a parent across from you saying, this is normal. And these are ways that you can support your child. I think that's another way. Or having, bringing someone to just talk about executive functioning in the frontal lobes because, have, the learning center. This is a perfect platform to talk about that, right? Because
sure.
it's really, really key. And executive functioning as one of the biggest predictors of outcomes in adulthood, more so than IQ, more so than academic um, experiences, it's one of the biggest predictors, if not the biggest predictor of outcomes in adulthood, health outcomes. Because again, if you don't remember to go to your doctor's appointment, don't pay attention to things that might be wrong, don't get your dental checkups, don't go do all of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, you have poor health, right? And
Yeah.
um, and so it directly impacts. And I think once you understand that, then you can provide, the parents can provide support. Because the other thing is, what do I do? How do I provide that support? And oftentimes you're acting like the frontal lobe for your kid, right? And you're, in a non-judgmental way. It's like letting them know that that if you post that
Hmm.
about another peer, that your friend could take a screenshot and share it with someone else who could share it with someone else. And now the
Yeah.
thing that you thought was between the two of you, they may not be thinking those steps ahead because their frontal lobe isn't thinking like that, right? So they
Yeah.
may need you to break it down about what could happen. Sometimes, friendships are really close, but then you have a disagreement. And then, oh, there's that screenshot I took, 6 months ago. And now I'm going to use that against the person who is not my friend anymore. And so they don't think about that, right? Those are the kinds of things that adults can help kids think through because they're not going to be, they don't have the frontal lobe capacity to be able
Yeah.
to think that far ahead. Right.
And I like that you mentioned earlier in your presentation about having that open conversation and dialogue and not creating a space where we're just teaching and talking to students and to young people, but actually having them be active participants in their learning and their understanding and their growth. We do that a lot in our affinity groups and our small group conversations
Mm-hmm.
when they're having ideas or expressing a feeling for them to take it down a level, right? And go into that thought process and not just blurt out a feeling
Right.
or a reaction, but really go into it. And as they're going into it, they're thinking about what that really means for them, how it resonates with them, and you see them processing that emotion. You see them asking themselves questions, and you're able to engage with them at that level, which is really important. I think there's not a lot of opportunities in a structured setting for those conversations to happen all the time unless we're really intentional about making those organic connections through learning and creating space for that in the classroom or within the culture of the school itself.
Yes.
Hmm. Well, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for everything you do in this field. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I know it's very late for you, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. If for everyone in the audience, if you have any additional questions about tonight's presentation, please reach out to outreach@hamlinrobinson.org. We'll connect with you there. As I mentioned before, we'll put up a recording of the tonight's presentation early next week. We'll have that available for you no later than Wednesday. And for everyone in the audience, thank you for joining this month's installment of the HRS Speaker Series. Happy holidays. Spend time with the ones that you love. Spend
Connection.
time to, reflect and recharge. It's been a really fast-paced year for some of us, and I think for all of us. And so we're just grateful that you're here, and we'll continue to work together, grow together to support our young folks. So with that being said, we wish you all a good night and take care.